Was Jesus a socialist? What does the Bible have to say about the role of government? How does our faith help shape the way we view economics and politics? Should Christians be Marxists, communists, capitalists, or maybe just all live in communes? We're going to talk about all of that and more on today's episode of Theology on Air. Well, welcome back to Theology on Air. I am Sarah Stone. I'm the Outreach Director for MDPC, and I also help run Theology on Tap, the ministry out of which this podcast is born, where we get a diversity of voices to talk about interesting cultural, philosophical, biblical, theological issues. And today we're going to be tackling socialism, where the gospel speaks to government, and this is actually a response to the Theology on Tap event that we have. This is our recap on the podcast of the event that we hosted a couple weeks ago. So I'm actually joined today by two of our guests from that event, Neill. Taylor came to faith through the study of philosophy and is now actively engaged in apologetics. He's become a regular guest of ours on this podcast, dialoguing and debating the existence of God. He also teaches an apologetics class at his church, and he runs the blog Neillology.com, where he aims to approach big questions with clarity and intellectual integrity. He can also do push-ups with no hands, gargle peanut butter, and sneeze with his eyes open. Folks, I didn't make this up. They wrote their own bios. Okay, and Gerhard Stuebben, a very special guest. Gerhard is a World Christian History PhD student at Baylor University, specializing in liberation theology in Latin America. Gerhard's work focuses on the contested use of Marxist economics among late 20th century Latin American liberation theologians. Gerhard and his wife Kim are both graduates of Baylor's Truett Seminary and live in Waco with their cat Juma. Did I say that right? Juma and their dog Griffin. So now you know about Gerhard's pets and Taylor's activities when he's not writing on Neillology.com. And again, this is Theology on Air. We are streaming on KPFT, which is listener-supported and community radio. So the only way we can do this without commercials on the radio is for you guys, if you like this, to call or go to kpft.org and give a little bit in the name of Theology on Air. If you want to do that, we would love it. This is how we're going to do things. For those of you that were not at the original event where we tackled this idea with a bunch of panelists, I'm going to let Taylor and Gerhard kind of give you a little peek behind the curtain of what we talked about that night and just tell you kind of where they're coming from on this idea of Jesus and socialism or not socialism. So I'm just going to let you guys jump in. Gerhard, do you want to start us off?
Sure, if that works best for everyone else.
That's perfect.
Sure.
So I think the most important thing, if I was just going to recap my sort of presentation at the event and sort of give my baseline thoughts here, I think John Calvin has a great line at the end of the Institutes in 420, 420, I think, where he talks about the different types of societies around the world and the different types of governments around the world. If you get into the very academic dialogue about the institutes, there is more debate than this, but the simple answer is that Calvin says, basically different societies have different governmental systems, and that's okay because God is over the whole world and God is not, in charge of the world through one particular way of organizing our political and economic lives. And so that's an important thing to remember as we begin a discussion about socialism, capitalism, and Christianity is that really the Bible doesn't say a whole lot about the specifics of politics or economics. It gives some basic moral principles and has some broader emotional style ethics that can be worked out into policies, like love can be worked out into a policy, charity, hospitality can be worked out into policies, but the Bible doesn't give a system of this is how workers should organize labor and this is how owners should organize their capital. This is things that Christians do to figure out, do later on, figuring out how best to live in God's world and how best to organize God's world. And so that I do want to say that there is today a sort of there's a sort of fashionability to socialism, and there's sort of a moral rightness to capitalism. Like there's these two sort of senses that we have of the systems. If you want to be edgy and a little bit bombastic, you become a socialist. If you're straight-laced, you become a capitalist, and you sort of defend these things. But it is important to remember that a political and an economic system is not a religion. It's not usually a moral issue. And so that even Christian leaders as conservative as maybe a Tim Keller in his book Generous Justice talks about how socialism sometimes might work better, capitalism might work better. And so we have to weigh these things on their merits. And so what's most concerning for me is what helps the poor the best, what makes for the most stable societies. And I think based on the evidence that sort of I'm going to be presenting today, that's socialism. But I don't think that it's inherently more Christian, except for if we're talking about the basic motivations of them. I don't think the organizational structure of a political or economic system itself carries moral weight, except for once we get to talking about how does this impact people's lives. And so what we're going to be talking about today is how do socialism, how do capitalism affect people's lives? And I'm going to be saying that socialism is in fact more moral. Taylor's going to be saying that capitalism is more moral. But at the end of the day, this is not because they, line up with our Christian principles in some ethereal sense, but because as Christianity teaches us to do, it helps organize society peacefully, because God is not a God of disorder but of peace. And it is hopefully a society that's going to help us take care of the poor, because the ultimate desire of Leviticus is that there would be no poor among the people. Or is that Exodus? One of the two. One of the important books.
Yeah. And I should say before Taylor goes that, the title of the event the other night was Jesus a Socialist? And of course, we all recognize that Jesus was not a socialist. The title is a bit of a hook to get people in, but it's anachronistic. We understand that socialism wasn't really on the table in the ancient Near East when Jesus was walking the earth. So just want to put that out there so people are listening. They're like, these Theology on Air people are kind of dumb. Taylor, give us a little kind of 3 to 4 minute of your kind of initial stance on this.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I could say, Gerhard, that there's a lot of sentiments in that opening address that you gave that I think we can find broad agreement on. So I appreciated a lot of that. At the same time, the core proposition that I'm going to defend is that not only does socialism not work, but even if it did, it would actually be immoral in practice. And that's because socialism is a system, in my view, wholly based on compulsion. Socialist governments have to insert themselves in a wide variety of issues because they're responsible for a wide variety of things. And so a necessary outcome of this is that socialism favors only a narrow set of values and perspectives. When people don't agree on matters of law and order, they have to be forced to comply. Now, I mean, you may be thinking to yourself, well, this is true of every form of government, and you'd be right. But if we make every matter a matter of law and order, then the acceptable range of disagreement becomes vanishingly small. So if we value freedom of thought, if we value freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, economic freedom, and the freedom to live by our own convictions, then I think the socialist power dynamic is one we would be wise to avoid. And in fact, I do think that capitalist countries do this better. A capitalist system requires only that you affirm this one principle, and that is, I want to live free and I want you to live free. So unlike in socialist countries, there's a huge amount of disagreement that we could have within that framework. We can disagree even on fundamental basic principles, but still be able to pursue our own goals and values. But on socialism, the government is responsible for everything, and therefore they have to control everything. And the result is an oppressively narrow range of things that we're actually allowed to dissent on. And so I think this sits very poorly with Christianity. God values our freedom so much that he created us knowing we would fall, knowing that we would rebel, and that ultimately he would have to send his son to die on the cross so that we could be reconciled to him. And yet he still chose to give us freedom. Because you see, I think that freedom is the virtue upon which every other virtue depends. You can't be virtuous without freedom. It's not virtuous, for example, to give all of your possessions to the poor if you do so at the point of a gun, which is in the end how all laws are going to be enforced. So the point that freedom is required for virtue, in my view, is so obviously true that it hardly needs explanation. And yet socialism curtails our freedom and expects of us virtue. And so it is, as C.S. Lewis said, we remove the organ and demand the function. So there are problems with capitalism, and I admit that. I mean, anytime we trust other people with their freedom, we take a risk. But I believe all other roads lead to despotism. And so I would paraphrase Winston Churchill here. He said that capitalism is in fact the worst system, except for all the rest of them. So in the end, my view is that the choice is not even really between fair and unfair. It's between freedom and that other thing.
All right. Wow, you guys both stayed under 4 minutes. I'm adequately impressed. I realized that I was going to let you have a little bit of a crossfire reactions to the other one. And as you were both talking, I realized, Gerhard, you didn't hear Taylor say his thoughts the other night because it was Evan representing that side. So you may not have things at the ready, like, I disagreed with these 3 things.
Sure. I hope that's okay that I just kind of laid out some propositions rather than recap.
Great. So I am gonna ask each of you to kind of come back at the other one with a few thoughts in response, but also I think we probably need to define some terms. And a couple of the questions we have anyway have to do with, like, what are the differences between socialism and capitalism? So maybe, Gerhard, I'll let you kind of tackle some basic definitions, at least of your team, as it were, and anything you kind of want to say in response to Taylor, and then we'll piggyback back to him.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to be clear, am I defining sort of socialism versus communism, or am I defining socialism versus capitalism versus feudalism as a third thing?
Why don't you stay in your lane and talk about socialism and communism, and we'll let Taylor talk about whatever he wants to talk about.
Great. So socialism, communism, basically in their most root sense are synonymous. How they're mostly used today, this is how most use will be, is that socialism is this broad category of anti-capitalist, because socialism was specifically developed as a response to the capitalism of the pre-Marx era. So this broad system of anti-capitalist economic and political system whose basic unifying message is that instead of private individuals owning all the businesses and hiring other people to labor on them, the laborers themselves should own the businesses in some way and not, give a cut of their labor's profits to that owner. Sort of the idea of doing away with the need for owners in an economic system and just giving the workers what they need. And that can be accomplished through various means. So the more well-known versions of this are the large state communist states where, like the USSR or something, will nationalize important industries, and people will be working for the government at their jobs.
Can I cut in for a second here and ask, if not now, in the next minute or so, can you retell the example you told? I really like the illustration you used during the event about the bar owner. I think
absolutely.
That aren't, experts at this kind of thing.
For sure. Yeah. So there's the state model, and then it can be, and there's maybe worker co-ops you can maybe define as socialist, depending on how you work with these words. But the basic idea is workers getting the profit from their work, not owners who are above them. The idea, or the illustration that I used at the event that Sarah's talking about, is that at a bar, you have, at the bars I go to, or at least used to go to, I am picturing one waitress, one waiter, bartenders. They're working frantically. They're working all night. They're doing an insane amount of work, and they're working from, 6 to 2 a.m. And at first it's kind of slow, and then it becomes kind of desperate over time. The bar manager at this place is pretty frantic too, because he needs to schedule everyone. So these people are working a lot, the bartenders, the cooks, the managers. the bar owner at the bar that I go to, again, this is an illustration, it's not sort of evidence, this is the sort of thing that I would use statistics for, but I do think this is borne out by the statistics. The bar owner sort of just sits there, gets drunk, hits on the women who come into the bar, very, kind of sleazy guy. So if we're following the national average, those people doing a lot of work make about $2,000 a month, and those people, and that person doing no work is making $5,000 a month. And socialists say that that is not how, that is not the most equitable and just way to organize a business. A better way would be for all the bar owners to co-own the property together and sort of each make the outcome of their labor, or some other socialized mechanism.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Was there anything else you wanted to say? Because I forced that into your time. So if you...
Oh, no, that's good.
Okay.
I think I will probably be using socialism and communism more or less identically, but know that there is a broad range of things that could encapsulate anything, as far as maybe the Denmark-Sweden area, though I would prefer to call that state capitalists. You could make an argument that it's socialist in a very fudgy kind of way. And it could encapsulate anything from that to various industries in Spain to the USSR to China. So it's a very broad thing. But when I use it, it's mostly state communism.
I got you. Before I pass it over to Taylor, what do you think the best example of a successful socialist society, try saying that 5 times fast, is today? Just to name one quickly.
Yeah, so if we're talking about successful by the standards, by what could be reasonably expected of them, I think Cuba's a pretty good example, has pretty low child mortality, has pretty good education, healthcare. Most of the socialist countries in the sort of golden era of communism. So one of the articles that I will be probably discussing with Taylor is a survey of the major socialist countries of the world right before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And its findings were that on average, socialist countries have better rates of doctors per civilian, or calorie intake, or healthcare, things like that. And so I would probably pretty welcome to looking at any socialist country of the 21st century that you would want to look at, but I would also want to look at the historical factors that might be involved in some of the problems that they might have. Like, a lot of people point to Venezuela without looking at things like US sanctions on their oil industry, which makes up most of their economy, things like that. And so for a quick answer, I would say Cuba. For a slow answer, I would say I'm happy to talk about whichever country, as long as we're allowed to.
That's really helpful, because I think most people, when they point to socialism, they'll say things like Sweden, and then the capitalists are, up in arms. Well, that doesn't really count. So that's really helpful. Taylor, I know you have lots of things you want to say in response. Just take it away.
Yeah, I'll try to stay focused, but just quickly, I appreciated that. I do agree with your designation of the Nordic countries as more of like a state capitalism with a really strong social safety net, for lack of a better word. My only real familiarity with Cuba in 2020 is that it's also kind of a repressive regime, as I understand it, and that's why we see a lot of immigration into the United States from Cuba. But and feel free to come back on that. You probably know more about it than I do. But I do want to get to this issue of the bar owner. The short version, my reaction to this is that the owner should make more money, because the owner takes all of the risk. You see, if the bar goes bankrupt, the waiter still has been compensated for the hours that they worked and that they agreed on, right? So they're not liable for the losses or the debt that the business owner took on board to get started. And that debt is going to follow that business owner for the rest of his life if that business fails, which of course most businesses do fail. And on average, it takes about 5 years for a business to become profitable. It might be slightly different in the restaurant industry. But the overall statistic is that 80% of businesses will fail by 10 years, and that most of them take 5 years to turn a profit. So yeah, I think emphatically the bar owner should make more than the waiter. He has more at stake. And also the beauty of free enterprise with a vibrant economy is vertical mobility. I mean, I could add a scenario to this, or I could just add one more piece to the scenario, and that is that maybe the bar owner used to be the waiter, right? And then he learned the business and he bought that business from the prior owner. And you see this happens all the time. As a matter of fact, most business owners worked for somebody else within their industry before they became the owner. You know, there's a quote that I really like about this, and it kind of describes how Americans think about free enterprise. And that it's by John Steinbeck. It says, socialism never took root in America because the poor don't see themselves as the exploited proletariat, but only temporarily poor millionaires. So the idea is that you can work your way up and learn the business, and then maybe one day you will own your own bar. And so to answer your question, is it better for the owner of the bar to be an owner of the bar or to be the underpaid worker? I think it's better for both of them if the bar exists. And again, with a vibrant economy, maybe you can start your own bar after a while.
Taylor, before you jump it, I know you're itching to get to that article, but before you do that, I asked Gerhard to kind of define socialism/communism. Will you kind of define, are you using the terms capitalism and free enterprise or free market interchangeably? Maybe just give us like a little quick how to think about those words.
Yeah, I mean, I agreed with the definition of socialism that was given, but just to draw the distinction, I would say that, you know, socialism is where the state controls the means of production, and capitalism is where you have this perspective that, you know, of private property and free enterprise. And this is also important because there are mixed economies, like the Nordic countries, right, that do have do control a lot of things, and China would be an example of a country that is a dictatorship in many ways, but they also still have a free market economy. So it can get kind of hairy, but just high level, I would say that the perspective on government in a capitalist society is that they're there to protect your freedoms, and you can do basically what you want as long as you don't affect other people's right to do the same. So my freedom basically stops at your nose.
Okay, so personal. It's right in my bedroom. Did you want to go ahead and respond to the article that Gerhard brought up the other night? I know that's something you guys might want to bat around a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, if that's all right, I can jump into that, and I'll try to be quick. As you say, I had a lot of thoughts about this. The first is that it was published in 1986. For reference, I was born in January of 1987. I know you kind of addressed this already, Gerhard, but I did have a little bit of a hard time finding contemporaneous sources on some of this stuff. And so and that's why I actually was wondering about the questions like what's a well-functioning socialist society today. But what I think that is helpful about the fact that it was published in 86 is that we can see how some of the conclusions of the study have aged. And I think it's kind of funny. I think you said in a previous discussion that the study proved that socialism is always better for the poor in general, but Cuba and North Korea are both given in the study as examples that are supposed to compare favorably with their capitalist counterparts, which, I mean, tells me that something has gone terribly wrong with this study. North Korea, I know it best for the satellite images that you see of it on the internet. And so I don't think that conclusion has aged particularly well. Secondly, they tried to explain it, and you've explained it as well, but I think it's very problematic that the comparisons do not include the United States or 18 other high-income capitalist countries in their comparisons, because I quote, they said there were no equivalent socialist countries. Now, I know that there's a challenge comparing the US to a Cuba in terms of GDP, but the solution can't be to simply throw out the data from the 19 best counterexamples that we have of capitalist countries because they produce too much wealth to fit into the parameters of the study. Third, I think that they categorize many capitalist countries or many non-capitalist countries as capitalists. That list includes Pakistan, Somalia, Tanzania, Haiti, Uganda, Honduras, and some other ones as well. Fourth, their data on communist countries relies on the reporting of communist countries. This is something they actually addressed in the article, but they seem to dismiss it, saying that because the state runs the economy, they actually have better data, and they use the World Bank as their primary source. But of course, the World Bank gets that data from the governments themselves. And one of those governments is the USSR, the former Soviet Union. And so if anybody has seen the documentary Chernobyl, you understand that they had a little bit of a problem with reliable data flow there. So I don't think it's a reliable data set. So, as statisticians will tell you, you get garbage in, you get garbage out. Fifth, the study does not appear to account for factors other than the system of government, like territorial or civil war, ongoing national security problems, things like that, that may better explain the discrepancies, which is something that you brought up in reference to the conversation we might have about modern day socialist countries. I would ask them to do the same for the countries that they studied. Mm-hmm. Finally.
Finally. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, last point, I promise. I told you I'd be quick, but I broke that promise, didn't I? So I think that the conclusion is a non sequitur. That is, even if the findings of the study were valid, which I think assuredly they were not, it wouldn't follow that socialism is a better system for the poor. It would only follow that capitalist countries should use the excess produced by their free markets to subsidize the basic needs of all people, something like the Nordic model, which we kind of talked about. So I'll stop.
Gerhard, what's kind of a quick, I want to get a little bit into some more of the theological ideas around this, but what's your kind of quick response to this idea that to say these lives are better and people are getting more calories, which in my life, that's the worst thing. I want fewer calories.
That's the problems of wealth, right?
Yeah. And I guess I shouldn't joke about that because it's people that are going hungry sometimes. But what would you say to people that would say, well, of course those stats are going to look like that if you're not comparing them against wealthy nations that are using capitalism to feed their people?
Mm-hmm. My first sort of thought, so that was a lot of thoughts. I have some notes here. My first sort of
a lot of thoughts.
Yeah, and I'll probably miss them, and we'll get back.
Well, feel free to take them one at a time, and then if there's something that I need to repeat, so that you can respond.
For sure. So I think I've come across a lot of this response when I've used the article, just that it's old, and it's true. I mean, I always present it as a study from the golden era of communism. So it is, as far as I know, as prestigious and rigorous as any academic journal is in its field. It's good. It seems to be handled with the sort of academic acumen that I would trust in a historical research in any other sort of area of my work. And so it seems like it fits the academic bar. There are some factors about it that people might find, that people might question, and this may be difficult because the listeners of the radio show or the podcast haven't actually read the article. This is, if you are looking for it, the authors are Sarah Zutto and Waitskin, and the title is Capitalism, Socialism, and the Physical Quality of Life. Questions about the data. It relies on the World Bank. That's just about as good as you're going to get. The World Bank relies on countries to report. That's just how countries are. Countries lie. Our country, like our president recently suggested that we stop doing coronavirus testing so that our numbers go down. Like, it's not as if the United States is this bastion of, reporting, or at least not this pure reporting that we imagine it to be. And it's not as if every communist country is this abysmal hellhole of reporting that people paint them as. Governments keep records. They need to know things. And so if the World Bank trusts it, academics generally pretty trust it. And it is worth noting that the World Bank is an extremely capitalist-leaning institution. So their sort of motives are to paint capitalism in the best light because it is the World Bank, the leading sort of capitalist monetary institution in the world. So I don't think any questions about the study's, like any general questions about the study's validity hold up much weight. It's old, yeah, studies are old sometimes. That was also the best sort of picture that we had of competing capitalism and socialism before the various factors, including the CIA, destroyed most socialist countries.
Move on from the study. I mean, that's it's just one small element of what we talked about the other night. I've got a million questions to get to, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's fine. Yeah, it might not be the best to focus on this study. I do think this, I will defend this, I would defend the study's validity, but it's probably not the best thing to talk to about the radio show that hasn't listened to it or read it. Yeah.
The only reason that I even brought it up at all is because there were a lot of sort of the virtual version of people's eyes going wide when you reeled off those statistics the other night. They were like, wait, what? Because I think people had this idea that communist countries, children are starving and people are eating rotten food they've waited in lines for. And then you were like, actually, that's not the case. So people were stunned a little bit. So I wanted to at least talk about it.
Would it be all right if I just said the stats that are from the study, just so the listener, like, not that we need to keep talking about it, but
that's fine.
The study found that infant mortality was almost twice as low in comparable socialist to capitalist countries. That's 71 out of 1,000 to 131 out of 1,000. Child death rates are pretty similar, 7% in low-income socialist countries versus 25% in low-income capitalist. Like life expectancy, there's about 10 years more oh no, I'm reading this wrong. The capitalist low life expectancy is 48 years. The middle income socialist countries are 72, the lowest is 67. So it's between 10 to 20 years more you get in a socialist country. And there's far more doctors in socialist countries, about 10% more doctors than in your average capitalist one. Oh, I'm sorry, not 10%, 10 times. So 19,000 versus 1,900. So these physical qualities of life are sort of what I would measure.
Oh, sorry.
No, sorry.
There's a slight delay, so sometimes I don't realize I'm interrupting you. When you're talking about infant mortality, we're not counting China in there, right? I mean, like, I mean,
presumably it would, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, China would be a large socialist country in the time that it was made. I mean, these numbers we're talking about are really high in some of these low-income capitalist countries, and that's something that is worth pulling apart, is that when we compare socialism and capitalism, we tend to compare the United States, which has all these rich resources and it runs basically the entire world economy through its military power and sort of trading and diplomatic resources, versus very small countries that are within the United States sphere of orbit usually. And so it is just by the physical nature of the comparison, you can't compare the United States and Cuba. But if you were to compare a capitalist country of the same size as Cuba, then that's where these statistics start coming in.
It's interesting. You're both saying that the other one is comparing apples to oranges. That's funny. I'm going to move us on just because it is theology on air, right? Not economics on air. So we're going to keep talking about government and economics, but of course through the lens of how we understand the gospel. One of the questions that kept coming up the other night was about if capitalism is so great, then why are we kind of relying on greed or human selfishness? So one of the questions that that was submitted for this was that, if human evil is the main problem facing capitalism, and I think many socialists would say something along those lines, how does expanding the power of humans in government address that problem? And we could take the flip side of that question as well, but I'll say it one more time and then I'd love to hear y'all's answer. If human evil is the main problem facing capitalism, how does expanding the power of humans in government address that problem? I don't know, Gerhard, that's kind of aimed at you, but...
Sure, yeah. So the assumption in Scripture is that more order is good. So in Judges, I think the most compelling to me way that I've seen to read Judges is to think of it as a pro-monarchy book. What's the tagline in Judges? There was no king in Israel and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. What's the idea is that anarchy breeds things like people hiring their own Levites to create their own silver idols. They steal from neighboring, clans of 20 people. This is what happens when you get anarchy, when you get a sense of freedom in what might be a sinful understanding, like an unhuman freedom, a freedom without constraint, without order, without structure. Scripture in the political sphere, in Judges, most of the rest of the Old Testament. In the church sphere, it says Paul, God is not a God of disorder, but of peace. The assumption is that things are basically better when we plan them out and not when we let people follow their own human inclinations, because we know that humans are fools according to Proverbs and evil according to the rest of the Bible. And people are stupid and evil. Why would we let just individual people fix things? The assumption in Scripture is that social units constrict our stupidity and our evil. So a monarchy constricts the people, and the nobles constrict the monarchy, things like that. In the New Testament, you have Paul saying, rebuke an elder publicly so that he may be ashamed. What is that? That's the sense of using the social pressure of the church to impact the pastor's ability, pastor's actions. All across Scripture, we have the assumption that order is good and disorder is probably going to be bad. And so that's what I would say is maybe my fundamental sort of approach to answering the question of why would giving the state more power deal with the sins that come with anarchy. Well, that's pretty much what we do with most other aspects of life. I don't want to have people to have the freedom to murder each other, so I set up laws. Our state does this. I don't want people to have the freedom to steal, so we set up laws, we set up police, these judges, these sort of institutions. We already give the state power in order to prevent sort of people's individual sins and evil from running wild and causing harm. And so that since this is already what we do, since this is sort of the intuition of Scripture, and since Scripture itself says God gave the rulers the sword in order to constrict human evil, we have this trifecta of, it makes sense, and it appeals to Scripture, and actually it's sort of commanded in Scripture to use the state as a check on evil, which, theoretically, Taylor and I might disagree or might agree on using just the baseline of those words, but I think that would go further than just sort of keeping me from punching you. That would mean the state keeping me from forcing you to work for me due to the fact that you would starve if you don't, so I can pay you whatever I want, so I'm only going to pay you $1 a day. Because God created us in order to structure, not in order to be anarchists.
Taylor, you want to push back on that?
Well, yeah, just a little bit. I don't think that that's a good characterization, that last bit you gave there about the relationship between workers and employers. I think that the best thing for workers is to have an abundance of choices of where they take their talents. And the alternative, again, is that you're forced to work for the government. So I don't think that we've solved that problem. And then just from a philosophical standpoint, I think that if your view of human nature is that people are too corrupt to be trusted with their freedom, then why would the solution be to entrust them with your freedom? So that's where we just come at this a little bit differently. Of course, I agree that we should set up laws that punish murder, but that fits within this principle of, I have the freedom to do anything that I want as long as I don't affect somebody else's right to do the same. Now, the working out of that in some cases could get a little bit tricky, but I think that principle should be the lamppost. And as far as the biblical case, I mean, I agree with some of the things that have been said. I don't think that Jesus is a capitalist or a socialist. I'm hesitant, in fact, to say what Jesus does support in terms of the role of modern governments in our lives generally. But I do believe that some political propositions directly contradict Christ's teachings about who we are and how we're supposed to view each other. And again, I believe that God values our freedom. And I believe that Jesus's moral commands are for each of us to realize on a personal level in our own lives, right? So like if Christianity says that the most important thing about us is that we're children of God, created in his image, beloved, holy, righteous, redeemed, worth dying for, then I can't think of anything more antithetical to that than Marx's view of human beings, which, Marx had very developed thoughts, obviously, on socialism. And he suggests that, the most important thing about you is what oppressor group you belong to. So according to this ideology, your ethnic, economic, and sexual identities pretty much determine your value and the value of your perspective. And what's interesting about this is that Marx actually agrees with me on this. Marx believed that his view of humanity was incompatible with Christianity. He said, I'm going to quote, The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness. To call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions. And so Marx believed that his philosophy was irreconcilable with religion. And at least on that one thing, he and I agree.
Question on that is, does the same not apply to Thomas Jefferson, who literally, like, the reason he wanted the separation of church and state, like,
it doesn't actually, but
well, I mean, the reason he wanted, like, us to have a free sort of non-state church society is because we would eventually evolve towards deism, like him, like most of the other founding fathers. So, like, does that flawed understanding of human nature in the founder apply to capitalism too, or just Marxism? Because it sounds like you're just applying it to Marxism and not capitalism, when it's equally applicable.
It's a good question, and here's the way I would approach that. I think that Marx's view of human beings is drastically different from Thomas Jefferson's. Thomas Jefferson was a deist, right? So he wasn't an atheist. He wasn't a Christian either, but he was a deist, and he was raised obviously in a very Christian culture. And he is the one that wrote those immortal words of the Declaration. He said that human beings are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He based his morality on a transcendent, unchanging standard that we call God. Now, he didn't think that that was the Christian God, but that presupposition is very, very different from the perspective that Marx comes at this with.
How different is it for a deist and a Christian and a Muslim to each say, my sort of, I'm talking about the creator, right? So if you're saying that a deist, I mean, I don't think that this conversation is particularly relevant, like the particular moral beliefs of Thomas Jefferson and Karl Marx. I'm only getting into this because you raise it. But I don't think that this is all that important. Why is a deist half Christian and an atheist Christian? Like, would Paul have said, Zeus is half Christian because he's based, like, their morality is based on a supernatural standard, whereas the Epicureans are based on nothing? No. For Paul, if you're, like, not a Christian, you're not a Christian, you're in this other category. And he doesn't think that they have, this type of pagan has a better philosophy than this type of pagan. Like, the world is just complicated and weird, and you can't just say, well, they believe in God, therefore their ideas are inherently better than the person who doesn't believe in God, because as we all know, like, the Christian church evolved towards the Aristotelian method away from the Platonic method, which evolved toward, like, these things have large, complex movements. And sort of saying God here, not God here, doesn't really get us much in terms of political and economic thinking.
Taylor, I'm going to let you come back on that, and then I'm going to move us on to another question.
Okay. I think it's vastly important, both from a philosophical and from a theological standpoint. And let me start by saying this, that deism is just a type of theism. It's a subcategory of theism, right? And so it would still, in my judgment, be almost the opposite of atheism. And if deism is true, or any particular theism like Christianity, Islam, something like that, then you plausibly have a standard that would justify the claim that human beings are valuable in and of themselves. But if you take away that standard, I can't see a really good argument for why we should believe that moral values are objective in any sense, which means that they're beyond human opinion. And if that's the case, if human beings don't have inherent value, then you can take from them, right? You're not violating any kind of ultimate moral principle by taking something that you want from somebody else because you can.
I mean, I would be highly skeptical of like the relevance that any of that has for politics or economics, because in the history of Christianity, this is the purest religion, this is the true religion. What we have thousands of years of slavery, we have thousands of years of 1,000 years of sort of expanding out the borders, and then we have 500 years of traveling across oceans to enslave native tribes, and these are the things that Christians do with their supposedly highbrow sort of theological understanding of the nature of humanity. So, like, why does a Muslim why does a Muslim in the 1500s treat their subject better than a Christian in the 1500s? Like, right? Why is a Christian under this caliphate have more freedom than a Muslim under the Castilian crown? Well, it's because the sort of philosophical, theological implications of like humanity and their various natures have very little impact on political and economic decisions in the real world.
I'm going to move us on just because Taylor, I know. Well,
I mean, this is true. It's not, show me an example other than maybe Philip of Hesse in his marriages where there's a really big impact on of philosophy that doesn't tell the ruling powers what they're already wanting to hear, impact on politics or economics.
Yeah, the abolitionist movement is one that comes to mind. But I would just say that
that was mostly because of changing economic structures, not.
I don't know. Some of the abolitionists had an awful lot to lose. But the very fact that you have this moral awareness that all these things are wrong and that Christians have gotten it wrong in the past, which I agree with, that shows that there is this moral standard. So you're actually arguing from my position, right, that it's important that there's a moral standard because that's how we tell that these things were wrong. That's how we course correct, because there's a moral standard. If we get rid of that, how do we course correct? And we don't have to speculate about what happens here, because the one thing that all the totalitarian governments of the 20th century had in common is that none of their leaders believed that there was a higher power in this universe that would punish them for what they were doing.
Okay, I am stepping.
Bush did, and he was a totalitarian and killed 1 million people.
I know. Whoa. We got to move on. I hate it, but otherwise, y'all don't need me, and I kind of want to keep my job. So I get paid a lot for this, I'm going to move us on because we had a bunch of questions come in the other night from our listening audience, and we didn't get to like 30 more of them. We'll probably get to like 2 today, but let me throw one of them out. It says, this was from a Facebook listener, using the Old Testament, isn't Israel's being a theocracy kind of the rub here? If we're told we can't legislate morality with regard to, say, abortion, LGBT issues, etc., can't the argument be made about wealth distribution? I thought that was kind of cool. I did have to read it twice to understand it, so I'm going to say it again, and then I will put it in the chat box in case you just want to see it. I'm kind of a visual person that way. Using the Old Testament, isn't Israel's being a theocracy kind of the rub here? If we're told we can't legislate morality with regard to, say, abortion or LGBT issues, can't the argument be made about wealth distribution? And I mean, either of you can answer that first.
I would question sort of the claim that we can't legislate morality. All law is fundamentally moral.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like, it is a theocracy. Yeah, that creates some problems. It's also a monarchy that creates some problems. It's also ancient Israel that creates. There's problems in interpretation. I don't think they're insuperable. And I get where the person's coming from. They're seeing like, how do I apply this here? Because it doesn't seem obvious how that would be applied. And I think that Paul's statement in Romans 7 is probably the best. I think it's 7 is the best sort of statement on how to think about the law. The law is holy, righteous, and good, and I wouldn't know covetousness if it wasn't for the law telling me do not covet. But this idea, the words of the law are not always the most important thing. The point of the law is to point to the transcendent morality in God's mind, which really isn't anything other than God's own personal preferences. But that's here nor there. The law points to God's transcendent will. And so it's not necessarily the case that every sort of line of it has to be literally applied. But if we look at the law, we might ask, why was this law put in place? Well, this law was put in place for this reason, to help this person, to protect this person. Oh, that means that God must care about this type of person. I think that's how we would use the law, not telling every farmer literally, cut off the field right there. And I don't know that we would need to make that a state thing, but it would not be a bad thing. I think most people would be fine with making it a state thing to implement the logic of it. Sort of how would we in our society protect the poor with our sort of business surplus? I think that would be perfectly fine to legislate that morality. And even if we came at it and said, I'm proposing this law as a Christian, I think that a Muslim, a Hindu person, like, I think there's enough overlap in these religions to where we could work out in a secular state while also not shying away from sort of our own rigorous interpretation of our own Bible as Christians.
Yeah, well, I agree with some of that. Let me give a very simple principle. And again, it's just going to be that baseline. I think that we should legislate with the guiding principle of what supports human freedom, right? I can do anything I want as long as I don't directly violate somebody else's right to do the same. And so you asked some interesting questions there, but I actually do think also that that's the most biblically consistent position, because Jesus does not prescribe a theocracy, in my view. And I agreed, by the way, with what you said about the questioner saying that, if we can't legislate morality, I think that that's obviously untrue. All laws legislate morality, as you pointed out. But the question is, whose morality do we legislate? And that's where it becomes very difficult. And that's where I think the comparison between socialism and capitalism is very favorable on that capitalist principle, because now, we're just broad strokes. We're trying to create as much freedom to disagree as possible. And then in a socialist side, you're legislating somebody's particular perspective on morality. And I think that, if we're lovers of freedom of thought, if we're lovers of freedom of speech, then, I think we're wise to avoid that dynamic.
I would be interested in how you think that works out concretely and practically in both societies. Can you give me an example of how capitalism does that and an example of how socialism does that? And preference here to the more general example, not a quick anecdotal thing like my cousin got a car.
Do you like your car, Gerhard? I'm just kidding. That's an inside joke for anyone that watched the event the other night. You'll have to go watch the event to get that joke.
Well, first, I'm going to point out that you just asked a philosopher to give a specific example. So let me just say, I'll do my best.
This is politics and economics. I mean.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, of course. So again, there are plenty of examples where, let's just use Cuba. There are certain things that you cannot say in Cuba that is hostile towards the Cuban government, right? It's actually illegal. And in the United States, you can shoot an image of the president in the head on TV. And, whatever you think about the guy, that is a stark contrast between a capitalist country and a socialist country. Over there, you say the wrong thing, you might go to jail. Over here,
that's not really a concrete example. That's if you say the wrong thing. I want a concrete example. Like, I want an example of something that you
how about pastors being arrested in China, pastors being arrested in the Middle East and in North Korea?
I thought you said China was a capitalist country earlier.
Well, they're a mixed economy is what I said. So
that doesn't apply necessarily in this context then. So we can't.
Okay, so how about North Korea? How about any one of the Islamo-fascist countries in the Middle East?
I mean, how does that relate to socialism if it's an Islamic country?
Because they're socialist planned economies.
So
I mean, like, let's just
theocracy is a socialist economy now?
Well, it depends on which one you're talking about.
Which one are you talking about? Which one are you talking about?
I'd have to look, man. Maybe.
So, I mean, you're giving me these examples, but you don't have actual examples. You're just saying.
You just don't like the examples I'm giving. How about Venezuela? I tried to stay away from Venezuela because you didn't want to use that one. But
I mean, I said I was happy to talk about it.
And I also already said North Korea, and I also said Cuba. I mean, I think those are concrete examples where they have speech laws.
What speech laws? No, I mean, like, if we're going to be talking about,
I mean, we can both run to Google after this is over. But
I mean, this is the point you were making, so I want to know what thing you were referencing.
Okay, wait. So when Taylor said, "What about the pastors in North Korea?" Can we not use that as an example?
Yeah. So he said, the pastors in China. So I'd be willing to talk about that. But earlier in the conversation, you said that China's more of a mixed economy, or China's capitalist is the phrase that you used. So, I mean, if it's capitalist or a mixed economy, then it might not be what we want to talk about. But I'm happy to talk about it if you want to. But that would make it back to socialist now.
So I think the simplest thing to do might be to talk about North Korea, but just as a point of clarification on China, What I said was that they're a mixed economy. They are, in fact, a dictatorship, which is something that is more characteristic of a socialist society, right? They started out as communist and they wrecked their economy. And so now they have moved towards more free market principles to try to revive the economy, but they have kept the stranglehold from a governmental standpoint. So they were in fact communists. Now they're trying to revive their economy. So that's the text for there. But obviously they're not governing by this principle that their people are free to do whatever they want as long as they don't violate somebody else's freedom. So I think it's a valid example.
Let me,
Okay,
whoa. I have to jump in here. Oh my gosh, it's just like the other night. Because we have just like 2 minutes left. We can go a little bit longer for YouTube and for the podcast, but let me just get this out. Like, what would you say the ideal goals of any economic system are? And then how would we know if that was successful? Maybe that's a better thing to find an anecdote from one terrible country or something, but the ideal goals of an economic system, what do you each think they ought to be? And how would we know if we're successful? You've got like a minute each, sadly.
The goal of an economic system, this is the only goal of an economic system, is to be a society in which everyone can live a decent and dignified life without fear of poverty and destitution and violence. That would be the goal of any society.
Well, that was but did you give an example of, or how would we know if it was successful? I guess.
Yeah, I mean, less
decent
infant mortality rates, calorie intake per capita, amount of violent crime, things like that. I would just normal sociological statistics. That would be how I would measure.
That's fair. Taylor, what about you? The ideal goals of an economic system, and how do we know if it's successful?
Yeah, well, I mean, without deeper consideration, I would just say an economic system that secures our freedom and provides equal opportunity for success.
Okay. And you would measure success, how so?
Well, yeah, I mean, so that's kind of the beautiful thing, and I hope you don't find this to be evasive, but that I think is something to be determined by individuals, right? So the economic system is not there to determine what is success. The economic system is not there to reward you if you do X, Y, and Z, because the system itself allows you to have your own principles, right? So everybody in the kind of system I'm describing, and as Christians within that society, obviously, I think success, looks like, living out God's purpose for your life and having a family and being a good, father, mother, husband, wife, things like that. But yeah, as far as the system goes, yeah.
Let me pause you there just because we've got to close this out so I don't make Evan do a bunch of editing later, but we're going to continue on because so many questions. If people want to find each of you, where can they go? Taylor.
Neillology.com. That's NEILLOLOGY.com.
Okay. And Gerhard, if people want to pick your brain about the article or why you're a communist or whatever, where do they go?
Probably Twitter.
Okay.
At Gerhard Stuebben, GerhardStuebben. And I'd be happy to talk.
Awesome. Well, for those of you listening on the radio, come back and join us again for more feisty conversations like this. And until that time, we always encourage you to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed. And we're back. There's so many things I want to ask, and we've only done one of our listener questions, but I wonder if we could tackle a couple things. I want to talk maybe a little bit more about Karl Marx. And I'm curious, Gerhard, if you have any thoughts on the social credit score system that's going to be implemented in China.
No, not really.
Great. Well, then that question's off the table. Okay. We had a couple questions come in about Marx the other night. I'm going to combine two of them and I'll put them in the chat box. One just said, does Marx's criticism have anything to offer Christianity? And then the other question says, this is a little longer, so buckle up. It says, seems like Karl Marx is always linked to socialism and communism and gets conflated with anything leftward leaning. So as not to oversimplify or reduce it to a soundbite, can you speak to Marx's theories besides communism that have far wider application and may even be good ideas to offer us? I'm, like I said, going to put those in the chat box. That doesn't help anybody else except our guests, of course. But do you need me to repeat anything, or you can see them?
I think I'm good. This is mostly directed towards me, right?
Yeah, okay. Of course Taylor is going to rebut.
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, you can talk about Marxist historiography is really important and changed the way how history was done. The effects of Marxist history on the field of history has been pretty significant. That's not the only reason, but we have seen a shift in the way historians write about history in the last 100 years or so, largely due to a lot of these new fields like Marxist historiography and things that spawn off of it, like feminist historiography, things like that. They're basically, that's causing historians to ask more concrete, practical questions about history, like how did people really live, not just how did the maps change over time. That would be the very short answer to what other fields might Marx have an impact on. And the reason he has an impact on those fields is because in Marx's work, he wrote quite a bit about history. And this is how I might answer the first question: how does Marxist criticism have anything to offer to Christianity? Now, I want to start this with, I'm a Christian. I think a pious Christian. I want to never sort of speak badly about the faith except for when it's warranted, and I think we need to be honest when it's warranted, and I don't want to oversell it because that would be dishonest too. But when you look back at the history of Christianity, it really does feel like the history of sin. At one point, Jesus is asked, why did Moses allow you to divorce your wife? And Jesus said, well, God allowed this because your hearts were hard. And things get really, really dark in the history of humanity. And if you want to take a more providential approach to it, you might just say the world is sinful and Christian empires are sinful because humanity's hearts are hard and we're sort of bent on doing sin. So we're bent on enslaving the Eastern Europeans to work in Central Europe. We're bent on enslaving Africans to work on our plantations that we stole from South Americans and Caribbeans. So there's really evil crimes in the history of Christianity. And one of the things that Marx does is that he gives a persuasive, compelling, and extremely critical history of Christianity's involvement with politics. And whatever people might say about Marx today, I think most people would agree with Marx's critique of Christian history and the way it has related to empire, because Marx showed that Christianity was often used as sort of the glue that holds medieval, early modern empires together and allowed for the continued subjugation and gave sort of moral justification to the expanding empires and really brutal evil that none of us would not call evil today. And so that Marx is able to show things about history and show that religion doesn't actually interact with politics in the sort of fairy tale storybook way. Religion and politics become intertwined, and religion becomes used as a prop for the state to do its evil. This is just how societies work. And a close example of this is maybe an example of this that sort of can orient the way we think about history. One of the, you know what? I'm just going to pass on that example because I don't remember the name of the exact African country.
That's fine.
Was it Ethiopia? I think it was Ethiopia. I'm just going to say it was Ethiopia. I'm 90% sure it was Ethiopia. So the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is the state religion, and that means that other expressions of Christianity are heretical. They're not allowed. So evangelicals in the early 20th century are trying to get into Ethiopia, and the state is persecuting them. So the Orthodox Christian state church is persecuting the evangelical missionaries. Now, that means that the evangelicals did not spread very much in Ethiopia during the time because the state Orthodox Church had so much power. Now, when the Marxist revolution hit Ethiopia, undid the state church, they made all sort of religions equal. That's usually what happens in a Marxist society, is that it removes the state church and no longer compels people to follow one religion or another. This is why you get the rebirth of sort of Caribbean traditional religions in Cuba and things like that. So when the Marxists take over Ethiopia, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is, just made one of the churches, and that means the evangelicals can flourish. And so because of the state church being overturned, Christian missions can flourish. And this is one of the things that Marx points out about the nature of Christianity and politics. Most of the time, Christianity and politics works in order to suppress people. But if you want real freedom, you have to undo that chain. And that's one of the things that Marxists have traditionally wanted.
Wow.
And so both in a political and a historical aspect, it can be helpful.
Yeah, no, that was surprisingly succinct given how big the question was. So I appreciate that. Taylor, I know you have thoughts. You have to. I mean, I do, but I'm trying to be objective.
Yeah, well, I mean, I didn't think I was going to have a lot to say about this, but as Gerhard got to talking there, I was thinking, yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I want to comment on that. And there's a couple of things I disagreed with as well. What Marx calls and what I think you called the history of Christianity being brutal and oppressive. I don't think that's
mostly me. Yeah.
Okay. So what I would say is that is part of our history, but that's the history of human beings. That's not merely the history of the Christian church. Pretty much everywhere you look from the ancient world, it's a story of the powerful, oppressing the less powerful. And that is exactly what you would expect as a Christian, because we're fallen beings. The second thing that I thought was interesting, and I just wanted to point out briefly, is that Marx, being an atheist, is very peculiar making this critique, because again, as I tried to establish earlier, there just isn't a solid moral foundation by which you can say one society is better than another. Indeed, if God does not exist and there is no transcendent standard of right and wrong, which by the way is not God's mere preferences, which I think you said earlier, but as you said at a different time, it's actually rooted in the mind of God, in the very nature of God. That's where morality comes from, if it exists at all. But if it doesn't, then by what means is Marx saying that Christianity was evil? And then there was something else I wanted to point out too. Oh, I just thought it was interesting that he said that the goal of a Marxist society is to make religions more equal. And then when that happened, Christianity actually flourished. Well, that's interesting. I mean, that's exactly what the founders tried to enshrine in America. And then one thing that just getting back to the original question, is there anything that we can learn from Marxism? And I think from an academic standpoint, sure. How does it inform our lives as Christians? No, I really don't. But where I will concede something is I think that Christianity has failed in our culture in important ways. We have become a Christian culture that stays in our home, and we don't talk about religion at the dinner table. We don't talk about religion at work. We practice our religion on Sunday, and maybe if you're one of the 10% of Americans that do it, you read your Bible, you have some other kind of spiritual practice. And I think that that's been catastrophic in our culture. And so I think that if we were better about that, then the appeal of socialism would start to wane. Because when they don't see Christians as active as we should be in plugging the gaps and taking care of the poor, well, then it's very attractive to think, well, why doesn't the state just do it?
Let me do this, because I do want to close us out eventually. I'm going to do, as our last question, unless something else juicy comes up, I reserve the right. But as our last questions, I want to talk about what have previous socialist regimes gotten right or gotten wrong? And when it's things that they've gotten wrong, how can we prevent it from happening again? Because I think, at the beginning, Gerhard, you talked about it's kind of this trendy, edgy thing, socialism, and then, the other side of it is capitalism is like, I don't know, entrenched and straight-laced people like that. I think there's a lot of fear from us straight-laced capitalists to think about socialism because we've seen it go really terribly wrong. So I want to ask that question. But before I ask that, the other night, Gerhard was talking about all these wonderful statistics about socialist countries, and someone rudely, who did apologize later, in the chat box, I don't know this person, said, we'll move there. And poor Gerhard got caught in the middle of his talk. But somebody else then wrote, no, for real, not in a mean way, but like, would you ever consider moving to a socialist country? So I just wanted to really quick throw that out just out of curiosity. Yeah. Would you?
Yeah, I mean, I would move to anywhere where I got a good job and I felt like I could have a good safety net and there wasn't much violence. I mean, the United States is not a particularly safe or good place to be if you're broke. Presumably, I won't be broke very much longer, so that won't be much of a problem. But I would much prefer to live in somewhere with a stronger safety
You
net.
sound like such a capitalist.
Oh my gosh, stop. Okay.
What? I don't even understand that. So, like, I mean, I would love for, to be able to go to the doctor, but because I lived in a capitalist society and, healthcare is tied to my employer, I can't do that over the summers unless I want to pay with money I don't have. And so sometimes I just have to deal with medical problems. Like, that's just not the sort of thing that you have to deal with in sort of more reasonable countries, even the more reasonable capitalist ones, or the socialist ones.
Okay.
I would go to anywhere that's got a good, decent way to live.
All right, fair enough. I mean, that sounds good to everybody, I think. So, previous socialist regimes, where have they, and feel free to take this into, not just economics, morally, where have they gotten it wrong or right? And then, of course, how can we prevent that? Say that America does take a shift towards socialism. What would we do to keep those things from happening? And I know Taylor has thoughts as well.
Yeah, so, I mean, the things it does right are just sort of the things I would push on earlier, is that it tends, especially among the lower income, which is most of the world isn't America. If we're talking about capitalism, socialism, or not being Eurocentric or Americocentric, we would talk about African and American capitalism equally. So the broader things that I think socialism does right are people are usually better fed, they have better access to doctors, things like that. These physical qualities of life, according to the article. The obvious things that they do wrong are like horrible human rights crimes, like genocides and things like that. These are horrible crimes that states do all the time. I think that you would have what you would need to do if you saw something like that coming is set up structures to prevent your society in going that direction. And it would have been nice if the USSR had that. It would have been nice if China had that. It would have been nice if the United States had that before we genocided, all the Native Americans and lots of Africans as slaves.
Can you?
Huh?
Sorry, the delay makes it so that you don't hear me talking for a couple.
Oh, no worries.
What would those structures look like? Like, build that out a little bit. You said structures.
Yeah.
We see that there's like a new Hitler on the rise. We put in what structure to keep that from happening?
Yeah, great question. I don't know. I think that so one of the things that Marx is really interesting on is that he used to criticize socialists, other socialist theorists, for having the plan laid out at the beginning of where the end step would be, instead of having, these are the goals that we want to get to, and we think practically about how we can accomplish those goals within whatever society we happen to be in. So in America, I mean, if we're just talking about what we would actually have impact on now, we're not going to get like a violent communist revolution. Probably the closest thing that you would get is sort of electoral change that pushes us towards a Nordic model. It's not likely. The Democratic Party has decided that we will not be that party by sort of kicking out Bernie Sanders and propping up Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Like, we don't have a party that's electorally pushing us in that direction, but I think an electoral shift would be the most likely way that we go to a state like a broader social safety net state capitalist society. If we had a violent revolution, that would mean that all of our sort of cultural and state institutions would be sort of burnt to the ground, and we would have to build them up from the start. And so I think you would have to be in that situation in order to actually build the safety nets to keep you from going down the crimes route.
So I was checking another source real quick before I go to Taylor, but if I heard you right, the structures you would have to put in place, you're unsure of exactly what they would be, but definitely one thing that would work would be to tear down current and dismantle current systems and then bring them back up from the...
Oh no, sorry. Yeah, no. So we would have to be, I think in order to answer that question adequately, and I wouldn't want to sort of answer it inadequately, in order to answer it adequately, I think we would have to sort of know what crime are we looking at preventing, and sort of who might it be against, and sort of what sort of structures does our institution already have in place that we can tap in order to prevent this from happening. And so in the United States, we have a really strong legal system. And so we would probably most presumably bring court cases, though, as we see that isn't really doing a whole lot with the kids in cages at our southern border, which is only a crime and different from these sort of crimes in sort of magnitude, not in quality. So I don't know. We're having a hard time figuring it out in our own state.
Sure. Taylor?
And the war in Iraq. I like to mention that there are 1 million people were murdered in the war in Iraq.
So I don't think we have time to get into that one. Let me do this. First, I just want to renew my objection to the findings of that study. I do not think that they are valid at all. I think that actually it's thoroughly discredited. But
who discredited it?
I gave 8 reasons why I thought that it was not credible.
But none of those were like calling into question the specifics of it. You're just saying.
I've just got a little bit of time here, so there's a few things I want to say, and then I'd be happy to go back to the study.
Okay, sure.
Because I had a few points that I actually left on the table for the sake of time. But I think it's a very bad study. That's not a reflection on you. I just don't. I've given my reasons on that. So again, I don't actually think that socialism has succeeded anywhere, including the Marxist-Leninism of the Soviet Union, Maoism, Communist China, Chavez and Maduro in Venezuela. And moreover, I think that Marx has been wrong about nearly everything that he predicted. The nation state has not withered away. Capitalism didn't break down as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Workers haven't become revolutionaries in general, but capitalists. Even you yourself said, I would move anywhere that gave me good economic opportunities. The middle class hasn't. The middle class hasn't disappeared. Indeed, globally, it's expanded to the point that now, for the first time ever, more than 50% of the world's population is not considered desperately poor. And that's never happened before. And then finally, Marx's attempt to use Hegel to create a scientific socialism has been a failure as well. And then socialism just denies what I think is an inherent human trait. Marx borrowed from the Enlightenment to say that human nature was malleable and constant, right? And Christian theology teaches that God is fixed, right? And that we're created in His image. And those two are in conflict. And we can talk more about that if you want to. But what I really want to get to is I can't think of a truly socialist state that I would say is successful. But I do have a list here that I was working on last night of socialist countries that I think have been failures. Everybody's favorites are the former Soviet Union, Germany's National Socialist Party, Mao's China, but then there's also Venezuela, North Korea, Yugoslavia, Albania, Poland, Vietnam, Bulgaria, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany, Cuba, Tanzania, Laos, South Yemen, Somalia, the Congo, Ethiopia, Cambodia, Angola, Nicaragua, and others. And in my judgment, they all ended in some varying degrees of failures when they have tried socialism. And so on the flip side of that, I think there's a good economic case to be made for capitalism. A study by the Coolidge Foundation found that as a country becomes more capitalist, they actually see significant growth in GDP per capita, life expectancy, educational attainment, and what they call democracy, which I believe is kind of their freedom quotient. So what they did was they studied countries that became more capitalist over time. And in other words, they looked at countries that were actively reducing the role of government and the impact that it had on people rather than increasing it. So the study looks at 25 years from 1980 to 2005, and the key findings were a 45% increase in GDP per capita, life expectancy increased from 62.5 to 67.5 years. The average age of schooling provided increased from 4.7 to 6.1. And what they call democracy, their freedom quotient, increased by 77.8%. So this is evidence that shifting a nation towards capitalism is actually good for the well-being of the average person.
All right, I know, Gerhard, you want to come back on that, but we can just go forever, and I don't want to do that. So I think in the interest of the kind of charitable conversation that Theology on Tap likes to have with people that disagree, I'm actually going to end on this note that neither of you will like, And so it'll equalize all of the distaste that anybody has if they're hearing this. I would love for each of you to very quickly, like 30 seconds, say what you think one failing of your own stance is. I mean, so if you're, Taylor, of capitalism, what's one failing? And Gerhard, socialism/communism, what's one failing? What's one thing that you don't like about it? And then we're going to close it out and say goodbye to our listeners.
Just so I sort of know, one failing historically, one failing politically, one failing sort of idea-wise.
I just came up with this question, so, I mean, take it however you want. Dealer's choice.
Was it to me first?
Either one.
Okay. Well, I'll just go quickly. I think I've touched on this already, but I just want to reiterate that capitalism needs Christianity to fill the gaps, right? I think that capitalism is the greatest force for lifting people out of poverty, but as Jesus said, the poor will always be with us. And we need a vibrant Christian church that is meeting the needs of the poor, that is taking care of people, that is making sure that people aren't slipping through the cracks. And as I said before, I think we've become a scared Christianity. I think we've become a yes, but Christianity. And I think we stay home way too much, and we don't actually get out and take care of people like we say we believe is important.
All right, Gerhard, close us out.
Yeah, socialist states commit crimes like every other state. That's the failure.
Okay, well, that was an easy question. All right. You guys can meet up later for a beer sometime if Taylor's in your neck of the woods or you're in ours, and you guys can duke it out some more. But for today, I'm going to go ahead and say thank you so much for joining us and for doing this again. And for those of you listening, come back and join us and listen to our other podcasts, and we will see you later.
Enjoyed it, Gerhard. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Evan can end it there. Real quick, how did you guys feel like that went? Do you feel like you got in what you wanted to say? I mean, there was so much more we could have talked about. Anything we left?
Yeah, it's a short time period. I thought it went fine.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I agree. The only thing that I think that I would have liked to have included that we didn't get to is I did want to end on a more conciliatory note, because as Gerhard started out by saying, this is not salvific, right? And, I think we should be a big church. And don't get me wrong, I think these issues are really important to discuss and debate. But, at the end of the day, we're supposed to treat each other with love and respect. And, our allegiance is not in Washington, right?
Yeah. Well, shoulda, woulda, but, maybe he could.
Yeah.
That's good.
Splice that in, would you?
Yeah, we'll try. Gerhard, thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for setting it up. Thanks for your logistics. And for your question leading.
Yeah, if you're ever in Houston, come grab a beer with us or come to one of our events if we ever meet again in person. So.
Sounds good.
Bye.
See you guys later.
Bye, y'all.